Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has had enough. He's just sworn a blood oath. The Ukraine war must return where it came from, as Zelenskyy promises Russia's total destruction. This is the last thing that Russian President Vladimir Putin wanted. He thought he held all of the cards in the tense ceasefire negotiations going on between Ukraine and Russia. But Zelenskyy just hit him with the news that Ukraine is about to turn up the heat. More drones, more attacks against Russian equipment, and perhaps most importantly of all, Ukraine is launching a new counter-invasion in Belgorod. Zelenskyy's dramatic announcement came during an evening address he delivered to the Ukrainian people on April 7. Today, Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky reported separately the front, our presence in the Kursk Oblast, and our presence in the Belgorod Oblast. We continue to conduct active operations in border areas on enemy territory, and this is absolutely right. The war must return where it came from. That's not a statement from Ukraine's president. It's a promise Ukraine isn't going to relent. And it's a promise that comes as Putin's attempts to delay proposed ceasefires relating to energy infrastructure and the Black Sea. Russia's leader claims that those ceasefires can't be enacted until the United States, which is trying to broker the deals, handles the root cause of the Ukraine crisis. That root cause is obvious to anybody outside Russia. Putin invaded, so he needs to pull his forces back. However, Russia's leader thinks differently. To him, the root cause of the Ukraine crisis and the reason behind his invasion is that Ukraine shouldn't exist at all. It is and always has been part of Russia. Putin believes, meaning the only way he'll agree to a ceasefire is if Ukraine ceases to exist as a sovereign nation. In response, Zelenskyy has just declared a blood oath that Ukraine will not only keep on fighting until the bitter end, but is prepared to do more damage to Russia than Putin could have ever imagined. Ukraine's strategy, as shared by Zelenskyy during his address, focuses on three key pillars: increased drone production, a counter-invasion in Belgorod, and the decimation of tons more of Russia's military equipment. The main focus was reports on drone production in Ukraine. We're ramping it up to the maximum, Zelenskyy declared. This includes the full range of drones, from Mavics to long-range drones. We're also expanding our domestic capacity to produce ground-based robotic systems. We're also working separately on fiber-optic drones. Just the beginning of this year, more than 20 new certified drone models with fiber-optic control systems have emerged. There's a lot to unpack from his statement. On the drone production front, it's been no secret that Ukraine sees increasing the domestic production of unmanned vehicles as being vital to winning the war against Putin. Why? Drones are perhaps the most important weapon Ukraine is capable of manufacturing domestically. According to the Kyiv Post, 96.3% of the drones Ukraine uses are built in Ukraine, rather than being supplied by any of its Western partners, and those drones do a lot of damage. By November 2024, Ukraine's drones were responsible for around 80% of the Russian casualties on the front lines of the war. For context, Russia suffered 45,720 troop losses in November, according to Al Jazeera. If drones are responsible for 80% of those losses, that means 36,576 Russians fell to Ukraine's intelligence use of unmanned vehicles in a single month. Assuming nothing's changed in terms of the effectiveness of Ukraine's drones, Russia is likely losing tens of thousands of its soldiers every month fighting an enemy that isn't human. In other words, drones inflict massive casualties on Russia, with Putin's forces struggling to exact anywhere near the same casualty rate on Ukraine because they're fighting drones. No wonder ramping up production is such a massive part of Ukraine's 2025 strategy. And ramp up is precisely what it's doing. By February 2025, Ukraine had increased domestic drone production to the point where it was capable of building 2.5 million of the terrifying unmanned vehicles per year. The vast majority of those drones are first-person view or FPV drones that Ukraine uses to launch kamikaze attacks against Russian troop deployments, armored vehicles, and military installations. That 2.5 million output is a massive increase on the 20,000 drones Ukraine was building per year at the start of 2024, showcasing just how seriously Zelenskyy is taking Ukraine's drone strategy. He's taking it so seriously, in fact, that 2.5 million new drones per year isn't enough. In March, Forbes military analyst David Axe reported that Ukraine's new target is to get to the point where it can build a staggering 4.5 million drones annually by the end of 2025. That would represent an absolute flood of a weapon that Russia is already struggling to handle. As one Russian military blogger put it, the main reason for the lack of success remains the enemy's air dominance. Their reconnaissance drones are in the sky 24/7, and any movement on our, meaning Russia's part, is immediately met with a massive wave of FPV drones. Put another way, Ukraine has already created a situation where Putin's forces can't make a single move on its territory without Ukraine knowing about it. If Ukraine can hit its 4.5 million production targets, every track move will be followed up by a horde of drones that hits Russia's forces before they're ever able to launch attacks. And the few that survive and don't scatter into the Ukrainian wilderness to be hunted down by yet more drones will also face these flying powerhouses whenever they begin an assault on a Ukrainian fortification. Russian forces can't leave their trenches right now. If they do, they're exposed to Ukraine's drones. And the more Ukraine ramps up production, the less effective Russian forces will be at a time when they're already struggling to take ground. According to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine have declined steeply since November 2024. In that month, Russia claimed about 242 square miles of Ukraine, according to ISW. By March, that number had dropped to just 78 square miles. If Putin's forces maintain that slow pace, the ISW says, it will take them over 80 years to finally conquer Ukraine. Now, with Ukraine amassing more drones to defend itself than ever before, the stark reality Putin has to face is that his gains may eventually shrink to zero. Or worse yet for Russia, Ukraine will use its growing army of drones to retake occupied territory. But Zelenskyy isn't satisfied with his massive army of short-range drones. He also mentioned that there is positive momentum on deep strikes during his address. Though Zelenskyy declined to share any figures related to these strikes, which see Ukraine hit deep into the heart of Russia, there's a reason why that momentum exists. In addition to creating millions of short-range drones, Ukraine is also building more long-range drones than ever before. That's according to The Economist, which said on April 6 that Ukraine is planning to boost long-range drone production to the point where it's building 30,000 of them to strike at Russia's heart. Add to this the manufacturing of up to 1,000 of Ukraine's long-range Neptune missiles, which can travel up to 621 miles, and a strategy unfolds that sees Ukraine hitting more Russian targets than ever before. It was already hitting plenty. In April, the Kyiv Independent reported that Ukraine had hit and destroyed over 77,000 targets using its drones in March 2025 alone. That represented a 10% increase over the drone destruction figures in February, and they demonstrate just how effectively Ukraine is using its drones. Of course, most of those targets aren't inside Russia. However, Ukraine has used March to strike against several long-range targets, such as the Engels air base from which Putin launches his glide bombs. It's also spent the last few months attacking Russia's oil refining facilities, to the point where it's crippled 10% of Russia's refining, taking 53 million tons of Russian oil offline in the process. Think about what more long-range drones mean for Ukraine. Its attacks on Russian territory will ramp up, meaning even more of Russia's refining capacity will get destroyed. The knock-on effect is that all of this destroyed oil can't be sent to the front lines or sold to any of Russia's oil customers. When it comes to the front line, a lack of refined oil products such as gasoline and diesel means Russia can't fuel its tanks and armoured vehicles. They become sitting ducks for Ukraine's short-range drones, with their inoperability also meaning Ukraine can take out more of Russia's troops. Pressure is relieved, and more relief comes from Russia missing out on millions, potentially even billions of dollars in oil sales as Ukraine's long-range strikes increase. Combine increased long-range drone production with 4.5 million short-range drones, and you get a massive 1-2 punch delivered to Putin's forces. They're getting bombarded on the front while dealing with ever more damaging attacks in Russia that destroy their supply lines. And it gets even worse for Russia on the drone front. Part of Zelenskyy's plan for ensuring Russia burns involves investment in fiber-optic drone technology. Remember that Zelenskyy announced that 20 of these fiber-optic drone models have been certified. The Kyiv Post says that 11 Ukrainian businesses are already working on their production, with those numbers likely to increase as we get deeper into 2025. Why do fiber-optic drones matter? The simple answer is that drones only have one real weakness, at least on the FPV drone front. They rely on radio and similar electronic signals to communicate footage back to their operators. Those signals are vulnerable to jamming, with NZZ noting that around 75% of small drones, both Ukrainian and Russian, are brought down due to their vulnerability to electronic warfare techniques. That's where fiber optics come into play. Drones that are controlled via fiber optics no longer need to rely on the radio signals Ukraine's current army of drones needs. They're interesting and innovative tools, with each of these new types of drones equipped with a reel of fiber optic cable that can stretch up to 12.4 miles. That cable means the drone and its pilot are always connected. It also restricts the drone's usage to short-term engagement. These two trade-offs are the sacrifices made to ensure the new fiber optic drones are 100% resistant to the electronic warfare techniques that Russia uses to take down so many of Ukraine's current drones. There's still plenty of work to be done with these fiber optic drones. Beyond the limited range caused by the cable issue, they often carry reduced warheads due to the need to carry several pounds of cable. Still, they could prove to be a revelation as Ukraine takes the fight to Russia even harder. Imagine Russian forces trying to take down a horde of regular drones only to find themselves having no defense against fiber optic drones. Ukraine is planning on making the greatest threat it poses to Putin's forces even more terrifying. But drones aren't the only thing Zelenskyy has up his sleeve. There's also what Ukraine is doing in Belgorod. Belgorod is a Russian oblast that lies on the border Ukraine shares with its enemy. In many ways, it's similar to Kursk, which Ukraine counter-invaded in August 2024. Zelenskyy's forces managed to capture around 93 settlements and 463 square miles of territory during that invasion. The situation in Kursk forced Putin to amass a huge force of 50,000 soldiers to attempt to retake the oblast. Moving into April 2025, Putin has mostly succeeded, as Russia claims to have recaptured the majority of its lost territory in Kursk, pushing the occupying Ukrainian forces out in the process. Kursk held a lot of value for Ukraine, having represented a symbolic victory over Russia and giving Ukraine leverage to use in future negotiations with Russia. But with Putin slowly reclaiming Kursk, Ukraine's next plan is to focus on Belgorod. How? By launching a new counter-invasion. During his address, Zelenskyy said,
Іще Білгородська область. Активні дії цими днями. 225-й штурмовий полк. Молодці хлопці. Пишаюся кожним і кожною, хто б'ється заради України.
For those who didn't catch it, Zelenskyy essentially confirmed that there is a new Ukrainian presence in Belgorod that's wreaking havoc on the territory at this very moment. Zelenskyy also confirmed that Ukraine is actively carrying out operations in both the Belgorod and Kursk regions, suggesting that counterattacks and counter-invasions are in play. Those operations have several purposes. If Ukraine can capture any territory in Belgorod, even if it's less than what it captured in Kursk, it regains leverage at a time when ceasefire negotiations are ongoing. However, most in Ukraine don't believe that a ceasefire will ever happen. So, more importantly for Ukraine, capturing territory in Belgorod will force Putin to dedicate more of his soldiers to the oblast, just as the Kursk territory gains did toward the end of 2024. More soldiers sent to Belgorod means Putin has fewer to dedicate to Sumy. That Ukrainian oblast is Russia's next target after it retakes Kursk, with Putin relying on the remains of his forces in Kursk to assault the region. If those forces have to be diverted to Belgorod, along with the soldiers from the Donetsk region that Putin has spent over a year trying to take, Russia can place less pressure on Ukraine. It's forced to defend its own territory rather than launch attacks, which opens up opportunities for Ukraine to counter and retake occupied territory. And again, that's where its massive army of drones comes into play. As that army grows and Russia's occupying forces weaken, Ukraine will retake territory while causing major issues for Putin inside Russia. Right now, we don't know just how deep Ukraine's forces have penetrated Belgorod. The BBC says that Zelenskyy suggested a Ukrainian presence in the oblast as early as March 18, with confirmation only coming with his recent address. It also reports that several Russian military bloggers are reporting on fighting taking place in Demidovka, which is a Russian town about 1.2 miles away from the border with Ukraine. That alone suggests Ukraine is deeper into Belgorod than Putin would like, with some bloggers even suggesting that Ukraine has captured and is now consolidating positions around Demidovka. Think about what all of this means for Putin. Just a few months ago, he must have felt confident with Russia retaking Kursk and believing his troops were making significant gains in Ukraine. Now, the tables have turned. He's losing territory in Belgorod, potentially putting him straight back where he was in August 2024 as his operations inside Ukraine stall out. Plus, Ukraine is amassing a drone army of such a massive size that Russia now has to deal with a future where its frontline forces will never be safe and its valuable infrastructure inside Russia is in Ukraine's crosshairs. Which brings us to another element of Ukraine's strategy: destroying as much Russian equipment and logistical infrastructure as possible. Depending on the source, Russia has lost anywhere between 20,000 units of military hardware since Putin began his invasion, or closer to 70,000. The insider says that Oryx, which only tracks confirmed examples of hardware destruction, places the figure at close to 20,000 compared to 7,600 confirmed losses on Ukraine's side. The Ukraine Ministry of Finance delivers bigger numbers. It says Ukraine has destroyed over 10,500 Russian tanks, more than 22,000 fighting vehicles, nearly 26,000 artillery units, and around 1,350 multiple launch rocket systems. Over 1,100 of Russia's anti-aircraft systems have fallen to Ukraine, along with hundreds of its planes and helicopters, and around a third of the Black Sea Fleet Putin hopes would allow him to apply pressure on South Ukraine from Crimea. The point is that Russia has absorbed massive losses since February 2022, and it can't sustain those losses for much longer. Putin has relied on pulling from ancient Soviet-era stockpiles to maintain constant pressure on Ukraine over the last 3 years. Now those stockpiles are depleted. The insider said back in February that only between 41 and 52% of Russia's pre-war reserves remain in its storage facilities. While that may seem like a lot, it's also worth considering that Russia has already removed the best weapons from those facilities. Those that were already working or could be easily repaired have been sent to Ukraine, where they've been destroyed. What's left is the dregs, the pieces of military hardware that are too far gone to repair or will require a lot of work to make them operational again. In the latter case, that work costs money and requires parts that Russia can only get from scrapping even more of its stockpiles. In other words, Putin is on a stockpile clock, and Zelenskyy knows it. He's made destroying as much Russian hardware priority because he knows that Putin is already struggling to replace what he's lost in Ukraine. Every decimated tank either doesn't get replaced or is switched with a worse Russian tank that's even easier to take out. The same goes for vehicles and artillery units. On that front, Russia has no more mortars left, according to the insider. It only has 531 of its 1,010 anti-aircraft guns and less than half of the towed barrel artillery with which it started Putin's supposed special military operation. And again, what's left is the dregs, the pieces of equipment that are in states of technical disrepair. Ukraine has to keep the pressure up. That's how it'll complete the reversal of the momentum with which Russia ended 2024. Zelensky's promise to bring the war back to Putin is being backed by Ukraine's massive drone production, innovation, new Belgorod counter-invasion, and its efforts to further deplete Russian stockpiles already verging on exhaustion. How could Russia possibly recover from all of this? And do you think that Zelenskyy has signaled a turning point in the Ukraine war with his latest announcement? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for the commentary on the latest developments in Ukraine's defense of itself against Russia. We strive to be an accurate, up-to-date source of news and information about military conflicts around the globe, and greatly appreciate your support.